Chapter 1. Homeless and Hostile. Eliot Cooper, an Omega College sophomore, slammed his suitcase shut in frustration. He'd been kicked out of his dorm due to false accusations of scent-related disruptions. His ex-roommate, an alpha with a grudge, had claimed Eliot's pheromones were causing unrest. Standing outside the dorm in the freezing wind, Eliot clenched his fists, feeling humiliated and betrayed by the unfair judgment. With nowhere to go, he had no choice but to sit on a bench and contemplate his next move. Rowan Hayes, a friendly beta classmate, approached Eliot after noticing his distress. Rowan, always the social butterfly, offered a solution. Eliot could crash at his best friend Theo's apartment until he figured things out. Eliot hesitated, unsure about living with a stranger, but desperation won out. "Fine," he muttered, hoping it wouldn't turn out to be a mistake. Rowan grinned and ushered Eliot to the car. Arriving at the apartment, Eliot was greeted by Theo Chambers, a tall, muscular alpha who radiated disdain the moment he opened the door. Theo glared at Eliot, his sharp blue eyes narrowing. "No way," Theo snapped, crossing his arms. "I don't do roommates, especially not Omegas." Eliot bristled but refused to back down, meeting Theo's icy stare with defiance. After a heated argument with Rowan mediating, Theo grudgingly allowed Eliot to stay for 1 week. "Stay out of my way, don't touch my stuff, and don't stink up the place," Theo sneered before slamming his bedroom door. Eliot sighed, knowing this arrangement was going to be hell. But he had no other choice, and part of him hated that he found Theo's grumpy demeanor annoyingly attractive. Chapter 2. Omega in an Alpha's Territory. Eliot woke up early to the sound of Theo banging around in the kitchen. He ventured out of his tiny corner of the living room to find Theo making coffee, his shirtless frame on full display. "Rule number 1, don't interrupt my mornings," Theo growled without looking up. Eliot rolled his eyes and grabbed a glass of water, determined not to engage with the alpha's obnoxious behavior. Theo spent most of the day ignoring Eliot, but his sharp gaze tracked the Omega's movements whenever Eliot walked by. Eliot could feel the weight of Theo's scrutiny, and it made his skin crawl. He was already regretting accepting Rowan's offer, but his options were limited. For now, he focused on keeping his head down and avoiding confrontation. Things escalated that evening when Eliot accidentally brushed against Theo while reaching for the remote. The alpha's nostrils flared, and his expression turned dark. "Watch where you're going," Theo snapped, his voice laced with irritation. Eliot glared back, refusing to be intimidated. "Maybe you should watch where you leave your stuff," he shot back, gesturing to the cluttered living room. Their argument ended with Theo storming off to his room, slamming the door behind him. Eliot sank into the couch, exhausted from the tension. He hated how Theo's presence seemed to dominate the apartment, but even more, he hated how his body reacted to the alpha's scent. It was infuriating and unsettling. Chapter 3. The Heat Incident. A week later, Eliot's heat hit him like a freight train. He had been taking suppressants diligently, but the stress of being kicked out and dealing with Theo's attitude had thrown his cycle into chaos. He barely made it to the couch before collapsing, his body trembling as waves of heat rolled over him. Theo, who had been in the kitchen, immediately froze. The air was thick with Eliot's pheromones, and Theo's instincts surged to the surface. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice rough. When Eliot didn't respond, Theo approached cautiously, his alpha nature warring with his common sense. "Eliot," he called, trying to snap the Omega out of his daze. Eliot whimpered, his face flushed and his body racked with uncontrollable shivers. Theo cursed under his breath, knowing he couldn't just leave Eliot in this state. "Damn it," he muttered, grabbing a blanket and throwing it over the Omega. He sat down across the room, keeping his distance while texting Rowan for help. By the time Rowan arrived with medical suppressants, Theo was barely holding himself together. The tension in the room was palpable, but Rowan managed to stabilize Eliot before things got out of hand. As Eliot drifted off to sleep, Theo stared at him from across the room, wondering why he suddenly felt so protective of the stubborn Omega. Chapter 4. Dangerous Secrets. The morning after Eliot's heat incident, the apartment was eerily quiet. Eliot avoided Theo's gaze, embarrassed by the previous night's events. He muttered a quick thank you as he grabbed a cup of tea, but Theo simply grunted in response. Though neither of them acknowledged it, An unspoken tension now hung in the air. Later that day, Eliot noticed Theo slipping out of the apartment late at night, his expression unusually grim. Curiosity got the better of him, and he followed Theo at a distance. He was shocked to find Theo entering an underground fighting ring, a place notorious for illegal alpha brawls. Eliot watched in horror as Theo fought brutally, his strength and ferocity unmatched. When Theo returned home covered in cuts and bruises, Eliot confronted him. "What the hell were you doing out there?" he demanded. Theo glared at him, his icy demeanor back in full force. "It's none of your business," he snapped. Eliot refused to back down. "You could get arrested, or worse," he argued, but Theo brushed him off, retreating to his room. Eliot couldn't shake the image of Theo in the ring. Despite their constant clashes, he felt a growing concern for the alpha. He wondered what had driven Theo to such dangerous extremes, but for now, he kept his questions to himself. Chapter 5. The Bonded Ex. Eliot's unease grew when Theo's ex, Damon, showed up unannounced at the apartment. Damon was a tall, imposing alpha with a smug grin that made Eliot's skin crawl. "I see you've taken in a stray," Damon sneered, glancing at Eliot with disdain. Theo's jaw tightened, his posture defensive. Damon wasted no time antagonizing Theo, bringing up their past and mocking his current situation. "You're babysitting an unbonded Omega now? How pathetic," Damon taunted. Eliot, unable to stay silent, snapped back, "At least he's not clinging to someone who doesn't want him." Damon's expression darkened, and Theo quickly stepped between them. After Damon left, Theo was uncharacteristically quiet. Eliot hesitated before asking, "Why was he here?" Theo's shoulders slumped as he admitted, "He's trying to drag me back into his mess. He doesn't take rejection well." For the first time, Eliot saw a crack in Theo's tough exterior, and it stirred something unexpected within him. Eliot decided he wouldn't let Damon intimidate him, or Theo. Though he didn't fully understand why, he felt a need to protect the alpha, just as Theo had protected him during his heat. Chapter 6. The Unexpected Consequences. A few weeks later, Eliot found himself feeling off. He dismissed it at first, attributing it to stress, but when the nausea and fatigue persisted, he began to worry. A trip to the campus clinic confirmed his worst fears. He was pregnant. The news hit him like a thunderbolt, leaving him reeling. Eliot decided to keep the pregnancy a secret for now. He wasn't sure how Theo would react, and the thought of being rejected terrified him. He avoided Theo as much as possible, focusing on his classes and quietly preparing for the changes ahead. Theo, however, noticed Eliot's strange behavior. "You've been acting weird," he commented one evening. "What's going on?" Eliot deflected with a vague excuse, but Theo's piercing gaze lingered. "If something's wrong, you should tell me," he said gruffly before retreating to his room. Eliot's heart ached with guilt, but he couldn't bring himself to tell Theo yet. He needed time to figure out how to navigate this new reality, even if it meant facing it alone. Chapter 7. Forced Closeness. Rowan visited the apartment one afternoon and immediately picked up on Eliot's mood. "You're hiding something," he said bluntly. Eliot hesitated before finally confessing the truth. Rowan's eyes widened in shock. "Does Theo know?" he asked. When Eliot shook his head, Rowan sighed. "You have to tell him. He deserves to know." Eliot knew Rowan was right, but fear held him back. Later that night, as he sat on the couch, Theo joined him, his expression unusually soft. "You've been quiet lately," Theo said. "What's going on?" Eliot opened his mouth to speak but froze, unable to form the words. Theo frowned, his patience wearing thin. "If you don't want to talk, fine," he said, standing to leave. In a burst of frustration, Eliot blurted out, "I'm pregnant." Theo froze mid-step, turning to face Eliot with wide eyes. "What?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eliot clenched his fists, bracing himself for Theo's reaction. "You heard me," he said, his voice trembling. Theo stared at him, a whirlwind of emotions flickering across his face. "We need to talk," he finally said, his tone serious. Chapter 8. The Fallout. Theo sat across from Eliot, his expression unreadable. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with tension. Eliot hesitated. "A few weeks," he admitted, avoiding Theo's piercing gaze. Theo exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "And you didn't think to tell me?" "I didn't know how," Eliot shot back, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "You barely tolerate me. What was I supposed to do? Announce it over breakfast?" Theo's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he pinched the bridge of his nose and muttered, "This changes everything." Eliot's heart sank. "If you're about to say I should leave, don't bother. I'll figure it out on my own," he said, standing to leave. But Theo grabbed his wrist, stopping him. "I'm not kicking you out," he said firmly. "I'm just processing." For the first time, Eliot saw vulnerability in Theo's eyes. It caught him off guard, softening his anger. "I don't expect anything from you," Eliot said quietly. "I can handle this on my own." Theo shook his head. "No. We'll handle this together," he said, surprising both of them. Chapter 9. Adjustments. Living together became even more complicated after Eliot's revelation. Theo began taking on small responsibilities, like cooking breakfast or making sure Eliot had everything he needed. Though Eliot appreciated the gestures, it only heightened the tension between them. Theo's protectiveness became apparent when Damon showed up again, this time demanding answers. "I heard you're playing house with an Omega," Damon sneered. Theo's expression darkened as he stepped between Damon and Eliot. "Leave. Now," Theo growled, his voice low and threatening. Damon smirked but backed off, muttering something about Theo getting soft. Eliot watched the exchange in silence, feeling both grateful and uneasy. "You didn't have to do that," he said once Damon was gone. Theo shrugged. He was out of line. Despite their growing understanding, Eliot couldn't shake the feeling that Theo was holding something back. He wondered if Theo truly accepted the situation, or if he was simply doing what he thought was right. Chapter 10. Unexpected Connections. One evening, Theo surprised Eliot by asking about the baby. "Have you thought about names?" he asked, his tone awkward but sincere. Eliot blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Not really," he admitted. "I didn't think I'd get this far." Theo frowned. "Why would you think that?" Eliot hesitated before replying. "Because I've always been on my own. I'm not used to this." Theo's expression softened, and for a moment, the tension between them eased. They spent the evening discussing potential names, laughing at each other's terrible suggestions. It was the first time Eliot saw a glimpse of the person Theo could be beneath his gruff exterior. For a brief moment, they felt like something more than reluctant roommates. As the night wore on, Eliot found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, they could figure this out together. But deep down, he still worried about what the future held, for him, for the baby, and for whatever strange bond was forming between him and Theo. Chapter 11. A Glimpse of the Past. Theo's walls began to crumble as he opened up about his past. Late one night, he revealed that his mother had been an unbonded Omega who raised him alone. "She always told me to be better than the alphas who looked down on her," Theo said, his voice heavy with emotion. Eliot listened intently, understanding more about why Theo was so guarded. "She sounds like an incredible person," Eliot said softly. Theo nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "She was. She deserved so much more than what life gave her." The conversation brought them closer, but it also made Eliot more aware of the pressures Theo carried. He realized that Theo's gruffness wasn't just about arrogance, it was a shield he used to protect himself. Eliot found himself wanting to be someone Theo could trust, but he wasn't sure how to break through the remaining barriers. For now, he settled for being a quiet support, hoping Theo would let him in when he was ready. Chapter 12. New Challenges. As Eliot's pregnancy progressed, the challenges of living together became more apparent. Morning sickness left Eliot irritable, and Theo's overprotective tendencies only made things worse. "You don't need to hover," Eliot snapped one morning when Theo insisted on walking him to class. "I'm not hovering," Theo replied, crossing his arms. "I'm making sure you're safe." Eliot rolled his eyes but didn't argue further. Deep down, he appreciated Theo's concern, even if it felt suffocating at times. It was strange having someone care so much about him. Things took a turn when Theo received an anonymous threat at the underground fighting ring. It warned him to stop participating or face serious consequences. When Eliot found the note, he confronted Theo. "You said you were done with this," he shouted, furious. "I didn't have a choice," Theo admitted, guilt etched across his face. Eliot glared at him, anger and fear bubbling inside him. "If you're going to keep risking your life, then I can't do this with you," he said, storming off to his room. Chapter 13. The Ultimatum. Eliot avoided Theo for days, refusing to speak to him beyond curt replies. The tension in the apartment was palpable, and it was Rowan who finally intervened. "You two need to talk," he said, cornering Theo one evening. "This isn't sustainable." Theo reluctantly agreed and approached Eliot that night. "I'm sorry," he began, standing awkwardly in the doorway. Eliot looked up from the book he was pretending to read, his expression cold. "Sorry doesn't fix anything," he replied. Theo sat down, running a hand through his hair. "I'm trying, Eliot. I really am. But the fighting, it's complicated." Eliot closed the book with a sigh. "Then uncomplicate it," he said firmly. "Because I can't keep worrying about whether you'll come back in one piece." Theo hesitated before nodding. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll stop. For you. For the baby." His sincerity caught Eliot off guard, and for the first time in days, the tension between them began to ease. Chapter 14. Unwanted Attention. As Eliot's belly began to show, rumors spread across campus about the unbonded Omega living with Theo. It didn't take long for the whispers to reach Damon, who decided to stir up trouble. "So, you're playing house now?" Damon mocked when he cornered Theo outside the library. Theo's patience snapped. "Stay out of my business," he growled, shoving Damon away. But Damon only laughed, his gaze turning toward Eliot, who was walking nearby. "Does he know what kind of alpha you really are?" Damon taunted, his tone dripping with malice. Theo's fists clenched, but Eliot stepped in before the situation escalated further. "I'm not afraid of you," Eliot said, glaring at Damon. His confidence surprised Theo, who pulled him away before things could spiral out of control. "That was reckless," Theo scolded once they were out of earshot. Eliot shrugged. "I'm not going to let people like him intimidate me." "You shouldn't either." Theo couldn't help but admire Eliot's resilience, even as it frustrated him. Chapter 15. The Baby-S Hour. Rowan, ever the enthusiastic friend, decided to throw Eliot a surprise baby shower. Despite his initial protests, Eliot found himself touched by the gesture. The small gathering brought a rare sense of joy and normalcy to their chaotic lives. Theo, however, seemed out of his element. He lingered on the edges of the room, avoiding the attention. Eliot finally dragged him into the festivities, handing him a small party hat. "You're part of this too, you know," Eliot said with a smile. The party took an emotional turn when Rowan presented Eliot with a handmade blanket. "For the baby," Rowan said, his voice soft. Eliot teared up, overwhelmed by the support he hadn't expected. For once, he felt like he wasn't alone in this journey. Theo watched the scene from a distance, his expression unreadable. He didn't say much, but later that night, he left a small stuffed wolf on Eliot's bed. Eliot smiled when he found it, touched by the quiet gesture. Chapter 16. A Fragile Peace. Life settled into an uneasy routine as Theo kept his promise to stop fighting. He took on extra shifts at his part-time job to make up for the lost income, often returning home late and exhausted. Eliot noticed the strain but didn't bring it up, unsure how to help. One evening, Theo collapsed onto the couch, groaning. "This is killing me," he muttered. Eliot sat beside him, handing him a glass of water. "You're doing the right thing," he said softly. Theo glanced at him, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks." Their fragile peace was tested when Damon showed up again, this time with a group of alphas in tow. "You really thought you could escape?" Damon sneered. Theo stepped forward, shielding Eliot. "Leave," he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The confrontation escalated, but Rowan arrived just in time with reinforcements of his own. Damon finally backed down, but the encounter left Theo shaken. "This isn't over," Damon warned as he disappeared into the night. Chapter 17. Rising Tensions. The confrontation with Damon left a mark on Theo, who became more withdrawn in the days that followed. Eliot noticed his distant behavior but didn't press him about it. Instead, he focused on preparing for the baby, using the distraction to calm his nerves. One evening, while Theo was out, Rowan visited Eliot with a concerned look on his face. "Damon won't let this go," Rowan warned. "He's dangerous, and Theo knows it." Eliot frowned. "Why does Damon hate him so much?" Rowan hesitated before replying. "It's personal. But whatever it is, Theo's trying to protect you from it." When Theo returned, he found Eliot waiting for him in the living room. "You need to tell me what's going on," Eliot said firmly. Theo sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Damon's holding a grudge from years ago." "It doesn't matter," he muttered. "It matters if it's putting us in danger," Eliot shot back. Theo looked at him, torn between wanting to shield Eliot and knowing he deserved the truth. "Fine," Theo said finally. "But you're not going to like what you hear." Chapter 18. The Past Revealed. Theo sat down and began to recount his history with Damon. Years ago, they had been friends, but their relationship soured after Theo exposed Damon's illegal activities to protect someone else. "He blames me for everything that went wrong in his life after that," Theo admitted. Eliot listened in stunned silence, piecing together the puzzle of Theo's guarded nature. "So, you've been dealing with this alone all this time?" Eliot asked, his voice softer now. Theo shrugged. "I'm used to it." Eliot shook his head. "You don't have to be. We're in this together now, remember?" Theo looked at him, a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "I don't want you getting hurt because of me," he said quietly. "Too late," Eliot replied with a small smile. "I'm already in the middle of it." For the first time, Theo allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face his battles alone anymore. Chapter 19. A Close Call. The next time Damon showed up, he wasn't alone. Theo and Eliot were walking back from campus when a group of alphas surrounded them. Damon stepped forward with a smug grin. "I told you this wasn't over," he said. Theo positioned himself in front of Eliot, his body tense. "What do you want, Damon?" he demanded. Damon smirked. "Just a little payback. You ruined my life. Now I'm going to ruin yours." Before Damon could act, Rowan appeared with several allies of his own. "Back off, Damon," Rowan warned, his voice calm but firm. The standoff ended with Damon retreating, but not before he delivered a chilling threat. "Next time, there won't be anyone to save you." Eliot clung to Theo's arm as they hurried home. "This is getting out of hand," Eliot said, his voice shaking. Theo nodded grimly. "We need a plan. I'm not going to let him hurt you, or the baby." Chapter 20. Strength in Unity. Determined to protect Eliot, Theo began working with Rowan and his network to gather information on Damon. Eliot, meanwhile, threw himself into preparing for the baby, channeling his anxiety into something productive. One night, Theo returned home with news. "Rowan found out where Damon's been hiding," he said. Eliot looked up from the crib he was assembling. "And?" Theo hesitated. "We're going to confront him. End this once and for all." Eliot's stomach twisted at the thought of Theo putting himself in danger again. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" he asked. Theo nodded. "It's the only way to keep you safe." Though he hated the idea, Eliot knew Theo was right. "Just promise me you'll be careful," Eliot said, his voice trembling. Theo stepped closer, placing a hand on Eliot's shoulder. "I promise," he said softly. Chapter 21. The Confrontation. Theo and Rowan's team tracked Damon to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The tension was thick as they approached, each step bringing them closer to a potential fight. Theo's thoughts kept drifting to Eliot and the promise he'd made. Inside, Damon was waiting, flanked by his loyal followers. "You really think you can stop me?" Damon sneered as Theo and Rowan entered. Theo stepped forward, his voice steady. "This ends now, Damon. Walk away while you still can." Damon laughed, but it was a cold, hollow sound. You've already taken everything from me, Theo. Do you really think I'll just let you live in peace? The fight that followed was brutal, with both sides suffering injuries. In the end, it was Rowan who subdued Damon, pinning him to the ground. "It's over," Rowan said, his voice firm. Theo stood over Damon, his expression hard. "Stay away from us," he warned before turning and walking away. Chapter 22. Aftermath. The confrontation left Theo physically and emotionally drained. When he returned home, Eliot was waiting for him, worry etched across his face. "You're hurt," Eliot said, rushing to his side. Theo shook his head. "I'm fine. It's over." Eliot helped him to the couch, his hands gentle as he checked for injuries. "You shouldn't have gone," Eliot muttered, his voice trembling. Theo placed a hand over Eliot's. "I had to. For you. For us." The weight of the past weeks finally hit Eliot, and he broke down, tears streaming down his face. Theo pulled him close, holding him tightly. "I'm sorry," Theo whispered. "I never wanted you to go through this." For the first time, they allowed themselves to be vulnerable with each other, their walls crumbling as they found comfort in one another. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Chapter 23. Rebuilding Trust. The aftermath of Damon's defeat brought a sense of uneasy peace to Theo and Eliot's lives. Though the immediate threat was gone, the tension lingered. Eliot struggled to reconcile his relief with the lingering fear of what might happen next. Theo, determined to regain Eliot's trust, began to prioritize their relationship over everything else. He made a conscious effort to spend more time at home, helping Eliot prepare for the baby. "You don't have to do this alone," Theo said one evening, handing Eliot a warm cup of tea. "I know," Eliot replied softly, his hand resting on his growing belly. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to relax in Theo's presence. They talked late into the night, sharing dreams and fears, slowly bridging the gap between them. As they worked together, a newfound closeness began to emerge. For Theo, it was the first time he'd felt truly needed by someone. And for Eliot, it was the first time he'd felt safe enough to let someone in. Chapter 24. A New Beginning. The days leading up to the baby's arrival were filled with both excitement and nerves. Eliot busied himself with final preparations, while Theo worked tirelessly to create a stable environment for their growing family. One afternoon, Rowan stopped by with a gift, a hand-carved rocking chair for the nursery. "I figured you could use this," he said, grinning. Eliot was touched by the gesture, and Theo couldn't help but smile at Rowan's thoughtfulness. As they placed the chair in the corner of the room, Eliot turned to Theo. "Can you believe we're really doing this?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. Theo nodded, his hand resting gently on Eliot's shoulder. "We'll figure it out. Together." Their quiet moment was interrupted by a sudden kick from the baby, causing Eliot to laugh. "Looks like someone's eager to meet us," he said. Theo smiled, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and anticipation. Chapter 25. A Family at Last. The day Eliot went into labor was a whirlwind of emotions. Theo panicked at first, unsure of what to do, but Rowan quickly stepped in to calm him down. "Get him to the hospital." "I'll handle everything else," Rowan said firmly. At the hospital, Theo stayed by Eliot's side, holding his hand through every contraction. "You've got this," he whispered, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Eliot squeezed his hand, drawing strength from Theo's presence. Hours later, the sound of a newborn's cry filled the room. Eliot looked at the baby in awe as the nurse handed him their child. "He's perfect," Eliot whispered, tears streaming down his face. Theo leaned over, his own eyes glistening with emotion. "You both are," he said softly. As they held their son for the first time, the weight of everything they'd endured felt worth it. They weren't just two broken individuals anymore, they were a family. And for the first time in a long time, they allowed themselves to believe in a brighter future.